Good morning and welcome to the Flood Impact Assessment Tool Workshop. My name is Nicole Cortez. I am the South Florida Water Management District Coordinator here today. I will be moderating this workshop. In-person members of the public who wish to ask technical questions during the Q&A session, agenda items 5, 9, and 13 must fill out a card and fill out specifically section 5 and give it to a meeting attendant. Members of the public participating via Zoom who wish to ask a technical question during the Q&A sessions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom or use the raise hand feature. If you're using a phone, please press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute. Public comment will be taken during the public comment session, agenda item 14. During public comment, in-person members of the public who wish to comment, please complete a comment card, specifically section 6, and give it to a meeting attendant. Members of the public on Zoom use the raise hand feature. If you're using a phone, please press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute your microphone. If you're having trouble with Zoom and need help, please go to our website at southfloridawatermanagementdistrict.gov and click the Ask Us button at the top of the page. We have a full agenda today. Please keep technical questions and comments to 3 minutes or less. This meeting is expected to end at 12:30 p.m. Now I would like to pass the mic to our Assistant Executive Director and Chief Engineer, John Mitnick, who will be providing opening remarks.
Thank you. And again, good morning, everyone. As she said, my name is John Mitnick. I'm the Assistant Executive Director and Chief District Engineer here at the South Florida Water Management District. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Over the last several years, the Water Management District has been making significant investments in our infrastructure that protects the residents and businesses of South Florida from flooding and ensures an adequate water supply out into the future. Our flood protection level of service program has been assessing the system's vulnerabilities as it relates to what the future may hold, whether that be from extreme rainfall events or rising seas. So I hope you're able to stay with us throughout the discussion today and learn more about how our latest technology and best available data is being put to good use here at the Water Management District to ensure the region's water resources are sustainable long into the future and continue to make South Florida a great place to live and work. With that, Carolina, I'll turn it back over to you for the first presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here joining a very strong team that had been working for about a year in this project. And we completed several tasks very successfully in a good teamwork. We have a packed agenda today, a very tight schedule. But excited to be sharing some of the process that we used to develop this tool, the steps. We're going to go through a series of presentations, beginning with our level of service. John introduced our program in his opening remarks. That's how we really measure those flood damages. So we build scenarios evaluating current and future conditions, to evaluate what is the vulnerability of our system and to look at adaptation strategies. So we're going to be going through the program beginning on this agenda today. Next, we're going to be talking about the tool, because once we evaluate flood vulnerabilities and we start selecting those alternatives, those solutions, we really need an important step, that is how we evaluate the damages associated with those alternatives. This is a big piece of the decision-making process. So we're going to explain you the steps that we use to first map those vulnerabilities and then go through the tool where we assess from an economic perspective those damages and what are the exposure buildings, footprint, roads that we have in the basin that is in the areas that we are evaluating in terms of flooding risks. So we're going to explain you all those steps, how we develop the tool, how we run. We're going to have a little demo. And then after we go through all those steps, we're going to talk a little bit about a similar effort, a parallel effort that is being developed by the Army Corps through the South Coastal Atlantic study. They also have a tool. We are leveraging some of the knowledge there. We are exchanging some of the curves that we use in our assessment with them. So we're going to have a presentation also talking about that. And then at the end, we are going to present 2 applications. So examples of how we apply the tool to look at some additional risks. We're going to talk a little bit about rainfall and compound flooding risks and how does that translate in terms of flood damage. And we are also going to talk about one of our grant applications, how we use the tool to provide the required estimate of cost-benefit analysis. So that's basically this agenda that we have for today. So the goal for this workshop is really to introduce you to the tool, walk through those steps, showcase how we can apply it, go through some questions, and then make some of this process and tool available for further assessment in the region. It's not fully available, but we're going to go through how we can leverage and collaborate in terms of partner agencies also getting access to some of the data and the tool that we are using here. With no further more to say and really excited to start jumping into the presentations, I will invite Dr. Hongying Zhao to talk about the level of service program.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone. And my name is Hongying Zhao, and I'm the Flood Protection Level of Service Program Manager, and also manage some level of service projects, including the one I'm going to present today, CA and the C9 Adaptation and Mitigation Study and the FIAT tool application. Sorry. Flood Protection Level of Service Program is a program designed to ensure how the flood control assets are up to the task, considering development, land use change, sea level rise, and climate change. This program assesses level of flood protection throughout the 16 counties, identify at-risk structures and needed improvement to operations, canal conveyance, and structures, and also provide a formal process to initiate retrofit and adaptation efforts for future infrastructure improvement and modification of regulatory criteria. Incorporate resilient design and construction standard. This program requires collaboration with local government entities, drainage district, and other agencies with flood control responsibilities. A typical level of service project is structured into 3 phases. Phase 1, assessment, focus on the flood control assets in the primary system. Also identify flood vulnerable assets and regions. If deficiencies and vulnerabilities are identified, a phase 2 study will be recommended. And the phase 2 study is about the mitigation and adaptation planning. Focus on primary, secondary, and tertiary systems. In phase 2, we collaborate with local drainage district, government, and the partners, stakeholders to identify projects, operations, or regulations to meet the flood control needs. Phase 3 is about implementation. Phase 3 design, permit, and build identified project to achieve resilience flood protection goals, also integrated into sea level rise and the flood resilience plan. As of now, we have completed 7 phase 1 study covering the basins in Miami-Dade County, Broward County, and also the Big Cypress Basin. All the relevant atlases in these basins are also have been updated. There are 4 ongoing phase 1 study and 1 phase 2 study. C2 and C111 phase 1 studies are also located in Miami-Dade County and will be completed this year. Upper Kissimmee Basin and Palm Beach County phase 1 studies are 2 new starts and will be completed end of year 23 or beginning of year 24. CAC9 Adaptation and Mitigation is currently ongoing, and the FIAT tool is being applied for the damage assessment in this study. In parallel, we are also updating all the relevant atlases. The plan for fiscal year 23 is currently under development, so stay tuned for that. In this slide, I'm going to talk about the case study, CAC9 Adaptation and Mitigation Study. The map on the right shows the study area. C8 Basin and the southern part of C9 Basin are located in Miami-Dade County, and the northern part of C9 Basin is located in Broward County. The phase 1 study of CAC9 basins are completed in year 2020. The phase 1 study concluded with flood vulnerabilities and deficiencies in structures are identified due to the sea level rise, and a phase 2 study was recommended. The objective of this phase 2 study is to work with the partners and the stakeholders to identify cost-effective mitigation strategies and also an optimized implementation plan. The project started with the stakeholder partner engagement and public workshop to collect and develop an initial list of mitigation projects. The other sequential tasks include H&H assessment, economic assessment, adaptation planning, and workshop, and final comprehensive report. And see that yellow box, the FIAT tool is being applied for the economic assessment. The economic assessment including several aspects. First, build on the flood depth or flood elevation GIS dataset from the H&H assessment. This tool will be used to calculate the flood damage and the damage reduction. And the calculated flood damage in terms of dollar amount will help to answer the critical questions such as what liabilities or risk is the system exposed to due to action or inaction. When combined with the cost estimate for different strategies, this cost-benefit ratio will be calculated and will be provide justification for selecting the best course of action, and also to provide the basis for the next step, adaptation pathway planning. The figure on your right side shows the FIAT tool interface, and we received a very positive feedback from our consulting team. The tool is very user-friendly and very easy to use. So, and Claire and Federico will talk more about the tool development, and Chris will talk more about the exposure database development. Excellent job, and thanks to the team. This slide shows a preliminary regional level strategy. We call it M2A. This strategy includes a suite of projects. Construct forward pumps at the S28 and the S29, raising the gate top elevations, adding tieback levees. And this strategy also includes adding 500 acre-feet distributed storage throughout the two basins, and also canal improvement to return to the design conditions. In this slide, the map on the left side shows the flood depth reduction for a 25-year 3-feet sea level rise event. The depth difference was calculated by with mitigation minus no mitigation. So all the light blue, dark blue colors shows the flood depth reduction. The FIAT tool has been applied to calculate the flood damage and the damage reduction, and the results are summarized on the table on the right side. For C8 Basin, this mitigation strategy will reduce the annual damage by $8 million, which is equivalent to a 63% reduction in comparison to the no mitigation strategy. For C9 Basin, this strategy will reduce the cost by $2 million per year, which is equivalent to a 17% reduction in comparison to the no mitigation strategy. And again, there's some caveat here. This is work in progress, so all the numbers are subject to change. Using FIAT tool, the economic assessment, including the benefit cost and the benefit cost ratio, will be calculated for all different strategies, which will provide justification for selecting the most cost-effective adaptation strategy, and also provide basis to support the adaptation pathway planning. The adaptation pathway planning also includes another key component, which is the project sequence. The figure on the right side shows an example adaptation pathway map, which shows the tipping point and the year the action needs to be in place. And Claire will talk more about this. The project will be concluded with a final workshop and also the final comprehensive report to document all the assessment and all the recommendations. With the development of the exposure database, this tool can be used for the adaptation and mitigation planning in other regions. In summary, I'm very excited about this robust, important, and easy to use tool. So with this, I completed my conclusion, my presentation, and I will give the mic to Claire Juncken.
Thank you, Hongying, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to explain a little bit more about the collaborations and partnerships that we have had in South Florida in the past 7-8 years. Can I have the next slide, please? So the future isn't going to look like the past, and it's deeply uncertain. We need models to help us understand how changing drivers will impact our flood risk. Next slide, please. And there are several drivers affecting future flooding. We know that sea levels are rising, exacerbating floods caused by storm events. But we also know that the intensity and the frequency of these storms will likely increase, resulting in larger coastal storm surges and stronger winds. Some areas will become wetter, while other areas may experience more severe droughts. And on top of that, the population and economy may grow or decline. So all these things drive our future flood risk. Next slide, please. So part of the question is how all these drivers affect our system over time. How much will flood risk increase? That's what is depicted in the top left graph. And it's not just the drivers of risk that we need to understand, but also what we as a community can do to reduce that risk. And we have various tools in our toolbox, and that is what the icons in the left bottom corner represent. We can think of flood protection measures like levees, pumps, and improved drainage systems, and natural and nature-based solutions like beaches and dune systems or wetlands, mangroves. Or we can make us less vulnerable by flooding by, for instance, oh, that was a little bit too fast. Or make us less vulnerable to flooding by, for instance, flood proofing, buyouts, and elevating properties. So how do these measures affect our system and change the flood risk? Next slide, please. To answer these questions, modeling needs to be better, easier, and faster. Next slide. And we work with various federal and local governments to achieve this goal. Let me highlight 2 federal partnerships before moving on to the collaborations in South Florida. Our longest partnership since 2000 is with the USGS. Together with USGS, we developed and applied the coastal storm modeling system, COSMOS, across the US. In addition, we collaborate with them on modeling coastal morphology and groundwater. Since 2020, we have a partnership with the Department of Homeland Security. Together, we developed and applied what we call the Community Flood Resilience Support System. This system enables community members, without being a model expert, to answer various what-if questions that a community often has. In addition, The physics-based system is super fast, taking away a common bottleneck in planning studies that simulations take a lot of time to run and therefore a long lead time. Next slide. The inspiring partnerships with the district, Broward County, Miami-Dade County, and Florida International University started in 2015. After establishing a memorandum of understanding between the district and the Dutch government. Since then, we developed and applied 2 lines of flood risk assessment tools and methods. Click, please. The first one is on the adaptive planning approach, ultimately resulting in the FIAT desktop tool that we will talk about more today. Click, please. And the understanding and assessment of indirect impacts of critical infrastructure disruptions during floods as a second line of applied research. Let me briefly explain both of them. Next slide, please. Hongying already mentioned it. We know that we need to take action now to start building resilience. The Adaptation Pathways approach allows you to make no regret decisions about what to do today by looking ahead in time and ensuring that these decisions will work with the options that may be needed in the future. Together with the district in Miami-Dade County, we carried out a study for the C7 basin in Miami-Dade County to provide input for the local flood mitigation strategy in response to sea level rise, and to demonstrate the use and application of the adaptation pathway approach for the region. Click, please. This figure is the obtained pathway map. It should be thought of as a transit map, showing how to navigate in the future while maintaining the objective that flood risk should not increase with sea level rising in the coming 50 years. Or in other words, things shouldn't get worse. The vertical axis shows the transit lines, the interventions that have been assessed. In this project, we considered 2 main types. Click, please. Something has gone. Okay, well, I'll continue. So the first type are the structural measures, consisting of local and regional flood mitigation measures. The second type of measures are land use measures, which include raising of buildings and roads to elevations of 6, 7, or 8 feet. The horizontal axis shows sea level rise as changing conditions. And there it is. And the small vertical black lines that you see in the graph show the end terminal of a line. This is called the adaptation tipping point of a measure, and it indicates that the measure no longer meets the objective. At this point, we must transfer to another line or implement a new measure. The open circles in the diagram indicate a transfer to another measure. The preferred pathway is indicated in the light green. And in this project, it was identified, implement a pump first at the tidal gate as a regional measure. After 0.2 feet of sea level rise, this measure is augmented with local flood mitigation measures consisting of local pumps, flap gates, flood protection systems along the canal. And the combined measure can handle a sea level rise up to 0.7 feet, after which a transition to raising building and roads is needed. Behind the tipping point, the small vertical black lines, sit many quantitative analyses using modeling and stakeholder input to assess current and future flood risks and the effectiveness of risk-reducing measures, as explained by Hongying. FIAT was the damage modeling tool used in this study and the subsequent grant applications that followed. You will hear more about the FIAT desktop tool in the other presentations today. Next slide, please. And the second line focuses more on what we call the indirect impacts of flood events. So together with Broward County and the district, we applied what we call the circle approach to understand critical infrastructure vulnerabilities and dependencies during floods. Building on the comprehensive flood modeling results of Broward County, we organized a series of stakeholder engagement workshops in which we identified various first, second, and even third order indirect impacts that result when critical infrastructure is disrupted during flood events. The circle diagram in the top right corner visualizes these dependencies. Next slide. In a second NOAA-funded follow-up project, we developed and applied a generic framework to assess the economic damages associated with these indirect cascading impacts of disruptions. Click, please, and the animation should start. So this animation shows the flooding of the road network in Broward County and how this flooding disrupts the operation of other facilities, such as airports, ports, hospitals, and businesses. In addition, disruption of the power network severely exacerbates these impacts because roads are not accessible and power cannot be restored. As a result, the indirect impacts of flooding extend well beyond the geographical flood extent, and we can now identify and quantify these impacts and bring them into the decision process. Next slide, please. And these are some resources resulting from this project that are available for you for your planning efforts. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think we're going to be opening the Q&A session once. So, Nicole, do you want to pick it up? We have some time, extra time, so please feel free to participate and join us.
Okay, we are now on agenda item number 5. This is the first Q&A session of the workshop. Yitzi, are there any technical questions that we've received from the audience here?
We haven't received any technical cards. Is there anyone in the auditorium who would like to ask any questions? Seeing none. Let me check the Zoom. Just a reminder, if you are on Zoom and would like to ask a question, please hit *9 to raise your hand and I will call on you, and then hit *6 to mute or unmute. We have a question from one of the panelists, Idris. Idris, can you hear me? Please hit *6 to unmute. I see you're on your phone. Please hit *6 on your phone to unmute. In the meantime, I do note another question has come in. Will the slides be made available? And yes, the slides will be uploaded online after the workshop. We have another question, and this is, does the South Florida Water Management District have any plans to add forward pumping capacity on the C7 Canal?
Yes, I can help answer this question. I'm not sure if Honging, do you want to talk a little bit too? So as part of our resiliency plan, sea level rise and flood resiliency plan, we do have among the strategies being proposed for the C7 Canal is the enhancement of the S27 coastal structure. We are proposing several measures there, including a forward pump to restore discharge capacity lost as a result of sea level rise. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a similar study case later today. We also are proposing raising some additional components and control building some of the features and really flood proofing the control building, elevating the gates. And in addition to that, we are also looking at how can we optimize overall flood reduction in the basin. And I'm not sure if Hongyin wants to talk a little bit, because that's really what the level of service program does. So yes, we have been proposing some measures for the coastal structure itself and some additional measures at the basin level.
Karina, I think you summarized it very well.
Good. Yes, and all those projects are included and described as part of our sea level rise and flood resiliency plan.
We have another question. How are the measures determined for the adaptation pathways, specifically the structural measures?
Shall I take that one? I think the most important part was stakeholder engagement. There were several, well, at least two, I thought, stakeholder engagement workshops at the beginning and throughout the project to identify measures to assess in the development of the adaptation pathways.
And I think to determine what is the most cost-effective mitigation strategies is really including two key components. The first one is optimize the cost-benefit ratio, and the second one is about the project sequence, which is also the adaptation pathway planning.
Hi, my name is Idris Dobbs. I would like to ask a question.
Perfect. Go ahead, Idris. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So for the adaptation pathways, you evaluated the costs of each adaptation pathway and selected the optimum one. That's how you guys came to your decision on some of these?
I can help start answering this question, but maybe Hongyin and Claire can come. There is no full optimization as part of the adaptation planning. We cannot really run all those alternatives and optimize from like a modeling perspective. But what we do in the adaptation pathway is to find some thresholds in time where we see that a critical condition is achieved. So for instance, let's assume that we have an innovation that we see damage to one of the coastal structures or an increased risk to some of the areas in the community. Then we understand that we need to implement a new measure. So we basically line up a sequence of those measures, and we measure and we define those threshold points when we need to move to the next level of project alternatives. And then there is a recommendation that we look at once we evaluate all those alternatives and the associated cost benefits. There is a recommendation that we make as part of this FPLOS phase 2 studies that really sequence those projects, of course, evaluate this best return on investment, but from a modeling perspective, again, there is no full optimization. And we also don't run any, I know the Army Corps does, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but I think you do some uncertainty analysis when you look at additional ways of doing like a Monte Carlo type of simulation that you kind of evaluate some of the risks in a more stochastic manner, maybe. But we don't do that. We really run a sequence of alternatives. We look at the ones that we define as part of our scenarios, and we line them in a sequence.
We have two more questions. What was the extent of the boundary you used when determining the economic impacts associated with loss of service or asset? To clarify, how did you tie economic impacts to the asset?
Hongyin is asking us to read the question again. I think I understand, but can you repeat, Yitzi?
What was the extent of the boundary you used when determining the economic impacts associated with loss of service or asset? How did you tie economic impacts to the asset?
So the way we look at the model, so in the level of service phase 1, we run different scenarios. We look at sea level rise 1, 2, 3, extreme rainfall events. And the model, will give us the flood inundation. This is one of the performance metrics that we have as part of the level of service. So basically, we have this advanced hydraulic model that we run. We build those scenarios after we calibrate the model, and then we look as one of the performance measures, the areas in the basin that are inundated. That's how we look at the flood extension in the basin. We also have one of the metrics that look at duration. Based on this map, where we really locate those areas that are inundated, and when we see a critical condition, we move to phase 2. So we keep that base condition, like this scenario without mitigation in mind there. We start at phase 2, we kick off phase 2. We look at all the alternatives that we have in terms of enhancing the system with the goal of reducing exactly this PM5, these areas that are inundated. So we run then multiple scenarios to those alternatives. So to each of those alternatives or group of alternatives, we run a scenario and we measure the reduction of the areas that are inundated. To give one example, we have one scenario that we look at elevating buildings, for instance. We look at all the buildings that are taken out of these inundated areas by elevation. We calculated a cost benefit associated with that. Then we run another scenario that we look at enhancing the primary system. Then we can look at a scenario that we are building some canal bank elevation, enhancing the structure. And then again, we map those areas that are inundated, the reduction in the inundation in the basin. We also have one scenario that we look at local projects. We know that are not just the regional system that needs some repairs, so we run a third scenario, and we look at regional fixes to the system, and again, we map the reduction in those inundated areas. The results, which is really the difference between the first vulnerability scenario and those adaptation scenarios, this is exactly what we use, that we bring to the tool. So the tool, the TARS, the FIAT, South Florida Water Management District FIAT tool, is able to overlay those different inundation scenarios with an exposure database that will tell us the flood damage reduction. And we are going to go through all those steps when we start talking about the tool. But yes, we map the inundation using those advanced modeling tools, and we compare those different scenarios in adaptation strategies by really looking at the reduction in the flood damages or the extension of this flood damage. We can continue with questions. We have some time. We are a little bit ahead in the agenda, so I think we can do 10 more minutes, 10 more minutes.
We have a question in the chat. Are you taking into consideration the additional pumping in the effect of saltwater intrusion along the coast?
We are not fully yet integrating the modeling that we do through the level of service program with the modeling that we do in terms of saltwater intrusion. So the answer to this question is yes, we are looking at those two things, but not in an integrated modeling approach. So we do have a team working with scenarios of sea level rise and reduction in sea level rise, in saltwater intrusion. We do have the team looking here at flood adaptation strategies, and we are going to begin next one study that we can perhaps start integrating a little bit more of those scenarios. But by the time we fix the coastal structures, and again, going back to this effort today that we are looking at flood risks and flood vulnerabilities, once we really start enhancing those coastal structures, elevating the gates, and really minimizing the risk of sea level or saltwater really moving inland, we are protecting our water supply, and we are really maintaining the saltwater from eastern, like to the ocean side. And there are benefits associated with saltwater intrusion as part of this effort, definitely. So,
Idris, I see you have your hand up if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure. Thank you. So does the flood impact assessments, do they account for coastal storm surge inundation, or is it just sea level rise, or both?
Yeah, in our assessment, search condition was included as a boundary condition. And basically, it's a combination of search and the sea level rise.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Okay, that concludes the first Q&A session of this workshop. If you do have any more questions about the presentations in this first session, please go ahead and submit them online, and we will try to address them during the subsequent Q&A sessions to follow. Now I will introduce our next presenter, Frédérique de Groen. She will be giving an overview of the flood impact assessment tool.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very happy to be presenting here today. So thank you for this opportunity. And I will give an overview of the SFWMD-FIAT Flood Impact Assessment Tool. Go to the next slide, please. I'll just be saying click because there will be a lot of clicks. I'll tell about three things. First, the calculation engine that's basically the back end of the South Florida Water Management District FIAT tool, which is called Delft-FIAT. Then I will talk a bit more about the tool and about the project that we did developing the tool together with the district, and something more about the output results. Click. And we'll go to the first one first. Go to the next one, please. So to get everyone aligned, I think there are quite some experts here on flood risk, but in short, to explain flood risk or flood damage, it is an intersection of a hazard, a flood hazard, exposure. So what is actually exposed to the flood, and the vulnerability. So that thing that is exposed to the flood, how much damage is caused when, basically. So if you click a few times so that everything is showing on the slide. Yes, twice more. Yeah, great, thanks. And in the tool that translates to damage or risk maps, I'll tell a bit more about the outputs as well. Flood hazard maps, and we have been told, well, there have been some questions about what kind of hazards are included, so compound flood maps maybe, or other kinds of flood maps, but this tool, so FIAT, is agnostic of what type of flood map is used. So any type of water depth or water level map can be inserted, and it does not care about where that comes from, basically. And likewise for the exposure maps, they are not included inside the tool, but they must be developed outside of the tool, and then it is inserted and used for the calculation inside the tool. And we are looking here at buildings, so damages to buildings and also damages to roads. And what is very nice about this project is that we also looked at the damages to the water control structures of the district. And then linked to the vulnerability are the depth damage curves or damage functions, where we used existing damage functions, mainly from HACES, from nationally approved damage functions, and one also that was developed by the South Florida Water Management District for their water control structures. Next one, please. And with all of this data that you see on the left side, you see the same icons, and then there's one additional one, the maximum damages, that's also required in the exposure maps to be able for the tool to eventually calculate the damage or the risk maps. You can go to the next slide. So in short, to explain what is it that this tool does, actually, it makes hopefully the lives of a lot of people much easier, what makes their jobs much easier, because it overlays all of these data layers with each other, and then it calculates per asset, so per building or per road segment, per rotor control structure the potential damage or risk from flooding. So if you take, for example, one of those houses, one of the buildings, which has a maximum potential damage of $100,000, the tool overlays that house with the flood map, and it takes the water depth. So you can go to the next one, which is, for example, 4 feet. Click, please. And I click a few times. There's more. Yes, one more time. Thank you. And with the depth damage curves that are also in the database, let's say, that the tool uses, the tool can see, okay, at 4 feet of water, it has a damage of around 42%. So you can click twice, I think. Yes, great. So it is a very simple calculation that the tool does. For this example, this house would have a damage of $42,000. And for example, if someone has probabilistic flood maps, so with return periods of, for example, 5, 10, 25 years, it also automatically calculates the integral of those damages for those return periods. So then that would result in an estimated annual damage. Next, please. So what did we do for the district where we are using this calculation engine in the tool that we made? Next one. We were basically doing 2 things to set up a streamlined system, a very easy to use interface to use the Delft-FIAT tool. Also to make workflows like this more standardized. And while we were working on this, we slowly discovered that it might also be very handy to have an exposure data builder that builds all this data that goes into the FIAT tool. And Chris will tell more about that after my presentation. And we also set up all the data for the C8 and the C9 basins, also making the assessments for damage functions, and really streamlining this whole workflow to an automated way of working. Next one, please. So how does that look like, that workflow? Like I said, Chris will tell more about the exposure data builder. So I will not go into that more. But that takes from different databases, it takes the data and it modifies it so that it is exactly the way that FIAT wants it. And those are the exposure maps. Click, please. And another click. Yes, so per region, now we did that for C8 and C9, but also if you would look at a new region, for example, there are 2 things that need to happen by more of an expert user. The mapping of a lookup table between source data and occupancy type, and a mapping of a lookup table between occupancy type and damage functions and maximum potential damages. And to say this more in simple terms, is that you need to know what data you have and what damage functions apply to which occupancy types. Because of course, not all the data is standardized in the same way. You might have different sources. So that is where you would need someone that is more an expert in this region. Next, please. So those are linked to the damage functions that are there. New damage functions can be added very easily to the tool, or damage functions can be altered also very easily. Next one. Next one. And then another one. Yes, thanks. And these damage functions, they can be kept in a sort of damage function database, so people can also take into account maybe which ones are better for what regions or what occupancy types. And then the easiness of use is that the actual user, so after this expert has made this mapping and the exposure data is there, the user really only needs to input their flood map, an event, for example, or some probabilistic flood maps. Our next one. And next. Thanks. And then the tool eventually produces the damage or the risk maps. Next. And this is a short demo showing really the actual use of the tool. You can start playing. Yes, so you see there's a folder structure. In the database, there is some exposure data already of a few different regions. And when I open the tool here, you can see that in a bit that those areas of interest, that they come back to this selection dropdown. So I will take, for example, a calculation for C8. It gives you a warning of the datum that is used and the coordinate reference system that is used. There's an event or a risk mode, and you can also run batch runs. So you can run multiple scenarios at once. And I am now just adding a scenario name here. There were some flood maps of the future with mitigation. And you can also see here that you can choose between entering a water depth or a water level map. Now I'm just filling in, I'm selecting the hazard maps, and this goes very quickly. I just fast forwarded that. I want to save a shapefile, so I clicked on that button as well. I also fast forwarded this part, but you will see later that actually the tool is very quick. It calculates, I think, by heart. Yeah. In 1 minute, 12 seconds, it's calculated the results. So you already see some results there. So it saves a few different formats. So here you see the CSV, which contains all the different assets as one line of a CSV file. So you have all the input data there as well. You see max potential damage, the damage function, and then all of the different damages for all the different return periods, and finally the EAD or the risk. It's a very long CSV, like you can see. So there are many objects. Now I'm just going back to see where it is. And I will show another type of output, which is the aggregated output. So you see the total EAD there, and I'm just going through the different categories that we used for aggregation, text use. It's going very quick now, but I have some slides on it. So I will, capture that again. Yes. And then you also see the shapefile there. And this is something that I will explain in a bit. So the run is finished. Yes, next slide, please. Next one. So because it went so quick in the video, I will just explain a bit more what type of outputs are there. So like I said, every object is a line in this CSV that is also output, which also holds the input data. It is aggregated into different aggregation levels that we define together with the South Florida Water Management District. And there are also spatial outputs in shapefile format. Next one. like I said, the output CSV. Next one, please. And yes, great. So yeah, you see the damages. Next one, please. So in this aggregation Excel, there is a global overview, so you can quickly see the total risk or the total damage for that scenario as just a quick check, and also for the damaged roads. Next one. And I think you can click a few times. Please, yes. Yes, thanks. So we determined a few aggregation levels, sub-basin, land use, tax use, census tract and block, and also poverty. And these are all very flexible inputs to the South Florida Water Management District FIAT. So they can be also exchanged very easily, and the tool will automatically then output that again in this aggregation Excel. Next one. And then the one that I sort of skipped in the video is a more, aggregated by groups. So we took this social vulnerability index, which is actually available over all of the US. And we grouped that more in categories, so more in bins. So you can see here, how much damage or how the damage is divided over the different indices levels. Next one. And then finally, you can also see the results in a shapefile, and you can make pretty maps with them. Okay, next one. I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. Let's transition to Chris on our 7th item already. Thank you, Chris.
Good morning. So I had the pleasure of working with the Deltaris team on preparing exposure data, and with the FPLOS team, knowing how they were going to advance use of this tool across the district as the FPLOS program goes forward. So when we initiated this, it became very apparent that we needed to standardize the approach and we needed to automate the approach, because compiling the exposure data is a very labor-intensive task. So the sources of information that we use are building footprints. In this case, we used footprints from Miami-Dade and Broward County. SFWMD maintains, with the other water management districts in Florida, a normalized parcel database that covers the whole extent of Florida. And we also, as a state, map land use at different levels using the same classification system. So both of these sources were good standard sources that would be available throughout the district, and were seen as something that had the information that would allow us to categorize the building footprints in a way that we could associate hazardous occupancy types. The district over the last 10 years has been working on development of a Topo bathymetric data set. This is aided through the USGS 3DEP program and the statewide acquisition of LIDAR and DEM data. So we've compiled a district high-resolution Topo bathymetric data set that we use to derive all the elevations that provide values relative to the flood inundation or flood depths that are estimated from the modeling tools. Last, we used hazardous occupancy types, damage functions, and depreciated replacement values to assign to calculate relative to what Frederic has just defined with regard to the cost, what is the maximum damage, and what is the cost associated with a given inundation depth. As Frederic's just showed, the inputs to the SFWMD-FIAT are the flood maps that we get from the FPLOS study, damage functions, which were derived from Hazardous, with a couple of additions that we created for utilities for our water management structures. And then there is the exposure data, which includes the locations and extents of building and road surfaces. What I'm going to focus on in this portion of the talk is the exposure database that drives the SFWMD-FIAT. So the process to compile the exposure data is extensive. What we're really doing is taking those objects and assigning values to them. Ideally, we would have a more streamlined process, but the purpose of trying to standardize this first effort was to come up with 13 processing modules, which generally process building footprints, roads, and utilities. And the output is this exposure data table shown at the bottom, which is what Frederic showed, which is a standardized input to FIAT, the FIAT model. So how does this work? We have a building footprint that we received from the counties. We join it with a combination of normalized parcels and land use data. That gives us a primary and secondary object type, which is used to then associate hazardous occupancy types, damage functions, and replacement values. The tool uses, the exposure data tool uses a lookup table that then can take the occupancy and secondary occupancy type and associate with it a damage function, as well as a cost per square foot, which is then used with the shape area to calculate a maximum potential damage for that structure. That structure is then overlaid with the Topo bathymetric data to calculate a ground elevation, a mean ground elevation of this building. There is a finished floor elevation that can be added to that, so that when in combination, that gives us the finished floor elevation, which we compare, which the FIAT tool compares with the flood inundation depth to then apply the damage function to estimate a cost. The same process is used for road exposure data. For that, for the road exposure data, we use NavTech or HERE roads, as well as the hazardous occupancy types, damage functions, and depreciated replacement value. In this case, we used a combination of function class and speed category to differentiate between streets and major roads. That's the hazardous damage functions are based off the number of physical lanes that those roads have. So then we use that in order to assign a damage function, which then is standard across all roads, but the replacement value is based off of the segment length times the value associated with the number of lanes to get a maximum potential damage for a road or street. We then assign an elevation value for each road and street road segment to then assign a ground elevation. So again, we can calculate that depth of inundation relative to the road segment to apply the damage function and get a cost. So the last category is utility data. We use the normalized data, normalized parcel data and land use to assign a type of utility. We then use the lookup table for that utility to identify the damage function. For the utilities such as electric and water control structure and water treatment plant, there is a maximum value for the facility itself. We then use the high resolution Topo bathymetric data to calculate the ground elevation with the finished floor elevation so that the FIAT tool could calculate the total damage cost. For all of this work, we relied on this district elevation model that was made using Esri's image management workflows and incorporates the best available data that we could find for the South Florida area. In summary, the exposure data includes road segments, buildings, and utility footprints. We incorporated finished floor elevations, which can be modified depending on local ordinance and zone. We identify primary and secondary object types related to hazardous occupancy types. We've used Hazardous damage functions. Those can be modified and or replaced, and it's as easy as updating the lookup table that assigns that damage functions, then rerunning it for the whole tool. And then, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, I'm sorry. And then we calculate the maximum potential replacement cost per object. These data provide a means for us to quantify the cost of flooding within the built environment, and they put a financial value on a flood mitigation strategy. The quality of the damage estimate is dependent on the combined quality of the input data, and we were very lucky to have the quality building footprints from Miami-Dade and Broward, as well as the great work that's done by the water management districts in compiling the normalized parcel data and land use link cover data. And also, we very much appreciate the opportunity that the legislature gave us to collect this high-resolution topographic data across the state, because this work would not have been possible without that contribution. So in summary, geospatial data are critical to our ability to evaluate and understand how to respond and mitigate for changed conditions brought on by changes in rainfall, ET, groundwater, and sea levels. We use a variety of information for that, but from the local area, what's really important is building footprints and normalized parcels. So part of what I wanted to emphasize here in this workshop is that we appreciate the work that is done, and we want you to know that it's very important to us as we go forward, that the quality is good and the values are sound, because these are direct inputs that allow us to use the FIAT tool to calculate these flood damage improvements or impacts. Thank you. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Catherine Roscoe to talk about lessons learned and next steps to scale this up. Catherine?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Really nice presentations, and it's really a pleasure to be a part of this. Yeah, if you go to the next slide, I want to just take a moment to talk about some reflections of how this collaboration went, and also where we're thinking of taking this into the future. What you're looking at here is what we call a harvest from a team meeting that we had at the end of the project. And it was really fun to hear what everybody thought about how the process went. So there's some animation here, so I'll just say next a few times. So the first thing to highlight is, for any planning tool, it really, it needs to be very easy to use, and we paid a lot of attention to that in the design, but it also needs to be scientifically sound. People need to be able to trust it, it has to be user-friendly. So that was something that came out from our reflections, and that we do feel proud about this tool, that we think we accomplished that. Next, please. Another key aspect we felt to why it was such a successful experience is just the energy and the teamwork. So there was just a really fun, engaged, really all hands on deck kind of collaborative spirit that went throughout the project, and I think made it really fulfilling on both ends, from Del Taras and the South Florida Water Management District. Next. So the knowledge exchange we felt was really paramount in this project. So on the Del Taras side, there was a lot of damage modeling expertise and Python-based tool development, and that paired really well with the context and content expertise at the South Florida Water Management District, as well as their GIS tool building prowess. So that was a really lovely collaboration, and I think both sides learned a tremendous amount. Next, please. And this collaboration allowed for some really interesting discussions about current issues, future issues, and how the South Florida Water Management District FIAT tool can play a role and be developed to continue to be meaningful into the future. So that kind of brings me to the second slide. There's only 2 slides here. Next, please. So, we also harvested ideas in this end of project team meeting on improvements and expansions that we envision and these are presented here, but we expect this harvest to evolve. And, if anybody present here has any input, that would be really welcome. So I'm going to also animate through these. So next, please. So these top items are related to improving the ease and the consistency of generating the South Florida Water Management District FIAT input data. So for example, we have here damage function validations and updates. That's really looking at how well do these damage functions represent the local and regional damage response in the area, and then updating to potentially do a better job at that. The second one is about, Chris presented this really amazing Esri model building tool model building process that she's developed. And one of our ideas is to sort of transform this into a Python-based tool with maybe a nice user interface, make this a little bit easier so that it becomes accessible to a wider audience and just increases the uptake and the usage of the tool and the development of the input data. And the one on the right is about first floor home elevations. So you saw when Chris showed it, they were mostly set to 1 right now. So yeah, I think this is a known issue, how to know what those first floor home elevations are so that for a given flood elevation, what, how much water is actually entering the home. And so we've got some ideas for developing methods for that. Next, please. Oh, this didn't animate very well. Well, the top is supposed to disappear. But the next thing on the list is training. And so training is a really key ingredient we see moving forward to increase the uptake and widen the user base for the tool and make sure that people know how to make modifications, update damage functions, update exposure data, apply to new regions. All of that we feel is really important and something that we're going to focus on, or we hope to focus on moving forward. And I'm going to say next, please, but I'm a little scared what we're going to see at. Well, okay. It looks a little different, but it's visible. So the last two here are just, if you look at the bottom two right, they're supposed to be the only ones showing. These are just two examples of some new development, development of new functionality that we brainstormed, but we expect that these ideas will grow. The first is to automate the benefit cost ratio calculation. That's a kind of logical next step we see to just remove some of the manual labor that goes into that process. That's what this has all been about, is making a consistent and easier process to do these type of analyses. And the one on the right is an idea to create water depth TIF by just drawing. So if you want to do some high level assessments, what if we would do this, just kind of strategizing quick scan style. You don't have to run a whole hydrodynamic model. You can draw something yourself and see how that would affect the impacts to see if it's a good idea to move forward with the more detailed, expensive modeling. Those are just some ideas, and we expect more of those in the future. And if any of you have any, of course, we're really interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you. I think that's the end. So you can do next. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, Chris, and Federic. Great presentations. That concludes the presentations for session 2, and we're now on the Q&A session 2 for those presentations. We have already received some technical questions on Zoom. Yitzi, please read those out.
Does the tool work on the barrier islands?
Maybe I can get this one. It's Frederic, by the way. The tool works anywhere where you have the data for it. So anywhere where you have exposure data, where you have flood maps, where you have the damage functions for, you can use it anywhere then. And maybe also then I can take immediately, that sort of fits with the same question, the question, does the output of FIAT tool assessment include or have the option to include damages accumulated over a specified period of time? So FIAT can also calculate risk. So then you would have an expected annual damage that could be over a certain period of time. So maybe that is more related to the hydrological modeling. If you assume over 50 years of time that certain return period flood maps occur there, then you could indeed calculate the damages over time. So that has a bit more to do maybe with the flood mapping side than with the FIAT tool side. Like I explained, for FIAT, it is it does not matter what kind of flood map you input, but it will give you the damages for that.
This is Catherine. Can I elaborate on that last one?
Yeah.
So, so for example, what's often done is so FIAT it sort of doesn't know what the flood map that you're putting in, where it came from or which year it represents. But as the user, you can you can input flood maps for today and flood maps under a future scenario, and that would give you the damage or the risk and how it's changing between those two timestamps. And so you can kind of simulate damages over time by inputting flood maps that represent different points in the future. So that's how you would use this tool to be able to sort of simulate that accumulated risk over time. So that's helpful.
I just want to add that as long as you've built out your exposure data, that you have those three critical inputs. That's the depth or water surface elevation, then you have your damage functions, and then you have your exposure data. So as long as you have an exposure data set built out for the area of your interest, then the tool can be applied quite easily.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone on Zoom that if you'd like to ask as an attendee, please hit *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute after we call on you. Next question is the base flood elevation plus 1 foot Florida Building Code requirement taken into consideration for this model?
So the finished floor elevation, it's a parameter that is in the input data set to the FIAT tool. So yes, it is taken into account and can be modified if you have that information on a building by building basis, or if you had it for a certain type of building like industrial, commercial, or residential.
Thank you. Next question. So does the district now have damage estimates for each building in the C8 and C9 basins?
So yes, as part of our FPLOS phase 2 study that is ongoing at C8 and C9 basin right now, we prioritize those basins and we completed the full development of the exposure database. So we can continue. We are right now doing this task at the C8, C9 basin to fully compare those adaptation strategies. So the answer is yes, we have the exposure database built for the both basins with all the buildings, utility, and roads already mapped.
Thank you. The next question is, did you do any sensitivity analysis to see how sensitive the results are to the assumed first floor elevations? I know in the C6 study that was a big factor.
So although we discussed doing sensitivity analysis, and that's why we included the first floor elevation as a value for input into the FIAT model, the length of the study did not give us that opportunity, but we definitely wanted to have the capability to do that, and it's available to do in the future if we'd want to.
And that's a very valid question. Just one little thing to add. When Chris talks about giving the ability for us to enter this in the tool, so we have a process, please correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but we have a process that we allow the user or who is running those scenarios to be able to really look at that and propose some additional For instance, I believe we use 1 above the crown of the road as the finished floor elevation as an assumption to larger areas. So, but there is the capacity to change and evaluate different assumptions in the model. The way we built the tool allows us to modify this assumption and do some scenarios looking at a different assumption.
To clarify how we came up with the finished floor elevation is we're using the bare earth DEM, and we are using the building footprint to calculate statistics for the elevation data within there. So you also have, not only do you take that mean or that median elevation that's calculated within the building footprint, you then add to it a value to represent what you believe the finished floor elevation is above the ground underneath the building. So we're taking ground elevation mean plus 1 foot or 1.5 feet or 2 feet to get that finished floor elevation.
Thank you. Idris, I see you have your hand raised. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So with the Sacs, one of the more enduring problems that we had with developing quantitative analytics for measures and for trying to express exposure and damages was reflecting things in common price levels. I mean, if you're managing data that's, basically the size of, 6 states and 2 territories, all of those structures are recorded at a price level. And so with economics, what we're trying to capture primarily is the relative value of assets, the relative value of certain types of specialized labor, certain types of building materials and fuel costs. And as you guys are all aware, those things have been changing radically over the past few years. So it's a challenge reflecting the proper changes in price levels if you're trying to have an influence on decision making. When your fuel costs go up by 20-30%, your labor costs go up by a certain amount. That ultimately has to be reflected in the prices. And so I was wondering, what challenges, or have you guys wrestled with this issue, and how do you plan to address it?
I would start from a cost estimate perspective on the way we cost our projects, and I will let the team perhaps talk a little bit about the damage curves that we are selecting for the study. But we do have a process that we are beginning to implement in terms of costing all those alternatives. So as part of the level of service program, we have different scenarios and different strategies that we are proposing, and we have cost engineers helping us to determine the cost for each specific alternative. And not only that, but also allowing us to fully capture O&M costs. This is also part of the way we get down to the benefit cost analysis. And you are completely right. We need to have the ability to fully capture all those changes in prices from a cost perspective of those alternatives. In fact, we are working just now on establishing a percentage that we could apply. We hire a cost estimator, an engineer, to do some cost estimates last year with us, and we know there are some changes that we need to fully capture, just updating this analysis this year. So there is a lot of work that we need to do, and we are right, we need to maintain this as an ongoing, I would say, effort to be able to look at those costs. But I will ask somebody from the team here to talk a little bit about how then we capture those damages using those flood damage curves, and the ability that we have in the tool to not only update those curves, but perhaps select different curves as we evolve.
So I'm going to start, and then I'll turn it over to Catherine and Frederic. This was a discussion during one of those discussions that Catherine was referring to in her presentation as to how could we, with these inflationary factors or potentially different costs in different regions, how could we provide that flexibility in the tool? And that exists, again, in this lookup table that allows us where we calculate a cost per square foot to then apply to our building footprints. So in this case, we looked at Hazardous data, and we felt that it was a little outdated and needed an escalation factor. So I'm going to turn it over to Frederic to talk about, or Catherine, to talk about what we did for the C9 study in order to address what we felt were potentially outdated costs that we used in the model.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Carolina, and also thanks for the good question. I think it's very relevant currently. For the C9 case, the price levels from Hazardous were, if I remember correctly, most of them are from 2018, and we update them with inflation to the current year usually. So that is not done inside the tool, but it is done to the exposure data that is then being used in the tool. So then you would have the current year price level. So anything that you would want to say from an economic study, for example, about price levels in the future, you could enter also in the exposure data relatively easily, and then run again for future economic conditions as well. So that might be a very interesting case to do as well if you have projections about future price levels. Catherine, do you want to add something?
I think that was really good. I was just thinking with this question that this is, could also go on our list of interesting potential new developments, because right now that would be some manual labor. You'd have to redo the exposure data if you wanted to look at several points in the future. I can imagine that's something that could definitely be automated. So I can imagine a future development could be that there's something in the tool to pick an inflation rate in a future year, and that this would be automatically done for you. That doesn't exist right now. It can be done, like they were saying, with manually changing the exposure data, which is already, I think, quite nice. But that does give us an interesting idea. It's a really good question.
I concur.
And just I'm sorry for interrupting.
Go ahead. We're just saying we concur.
Okay. So typically with the Corps of Engineers, when we do economic analysis, we usually reflect price level. We synergize the price level with the point in time where we make decisions. So usually we won't like update the price level throughout an analytical life cycle. We would make sure we try as best we can to reflect costs and benefits, in the year of the price level assessment. And I mean, this is a really good discussion because it basically implies a perpetual cost. If you have a tool that you want to maintain for use, in perpetuity, every year you've got to update your materials price levels. And so, and when you have, roughly 8% inflation, I mean, that makes that much more important. So anyways, thank you for the discussion.
Thank you. I think this leads very nicely to the next question. Do you see this tool replacing Hazardous, the Fema tool, for damage calculations per hazard, or working in conjunction with or supplement to the Hazardous tool for hazard planning?
I think I want to turn this over to Catherine to answer, but what we were trying to do is not find a replacement for Hazardous, but instead provide a tool that would allow us to look at an economic benefit to a mitigation strategy. So we know what the losses would be without mitigation in place, and this allowed us to look at what was the economic value of these mitigations, so we could then do the cost benefit. But Catherine or Claire, I guess, do you want to talk about what FIAT can do and what FIAT doesn't do that Hazardous does?
I would like to add something to this, and Catherine, maybe you can add to mine, but FIAT is specifically designed for flood hazards, whereas Hazardous considers multiple hazards. Catherine, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's not meant to replace Hazardous, and I think Hazardous can do many more things than just this. I think this tool is just meant to make it really easy. When you've done your own flood modeling and you've looked at mitigation, like Chris was saying, that's where this is really useful, because it allows you to look at reduced damages based on those. On those strategies, and also looking in a lot of detail and getting output also maybe at a more sort of very customized, aggregated, or individual asset level damages. So it offers some features that make that process more streamlined and useful, I think, for district purposes, but it's definitely not meant to be a replacement.
I'd like to add that there is a lot of effort that's going into developing the exposure data. So I think that there is value in looking at how the exposure data work that we're doing for the FIAT tool can be leveraged by Hazardous, and more of a complement than a replacement.
I was going to say just that, Chris, because I think there are local relevant information that we were able to capture when we built our exposure database that really aligns with the needs of our region and represents what we are bringing to the decision now. So I think we move ahead a little bit further when we develop our exposure database in comparison with the Hazardous database that we were first exposed to. So there is definitely a tremendous work done by the team that was responsible for the exposure database here, really bringing the latest data, best available information to us, great level of information that can really help us to reflect our local needs here.
Thank you. Next question is, how does the tool differentiate damage estimates between single-story and multi-story buildings?
I think I'll ask Frederic to answer that, but it is in the damage functions and in the occupancy type. Frederic, could you handle that?
Yes, thanks, Chris. I sort of expected you to say a little bit, and I like that you know everything. You know so much already, so that is great. Well, like Chris said, indeed, it is handled by the different damage functions per occupancy type, like I talked about those sort of linking tables per occupancy type. So if you have in the occupancy type single story or multi-story, for example, buildings, then you can put different damage curves there as well that allow for differentiating this in the right way.
Thank you. Next question. Will the FIAT tool and data be made available to the public?
I can talk quickly now, and I'll have a slide at the end of the presentation making very clearly on the steps. But the tool itself is open source tool. It's available to the public. But the basic portion is we have an exposure database that needs to go along. So, and that's the piece that we need to detail on how we're going to be bringing this out.
Thank you. We have one more question in the chat. Oh, I see one more answer. Go ahead.
So the three inputs to the model, the water surface or flood depths, the damage functions, and the exposure data were selected and evaluated with that local expertise for the area that we were working in. As we extend the FPLOS, we will be extending the extent of the exposure data. And if it's already available for a basin, we'd be glad to provide it. And Carolina will provide you information at the end of the presentation or at the end of the workshop on how you would go about getting that. And as we move into different regions and we do more work, we will be building out that exposure data. I do have to say that we do have to figure out a duration that it'll be appropriate for, because we are using current 2018 2020 building footprints, and if there is extensive development in an area, the exposure data, at least for the buildings, well, and the roads too, and the utilities, would have to be updated to address those changes.
Thank you. The final question in the chat we have is replacement value based on some industry standards, such as building and/or insurance industries.
We're using Hazardous depreciated replacement values, and Catherine will be able to provide more detail on those, and then we did apply an inflationary factor to that, or maybe Frederic, I'm not sure.
I'm happy to take that. We used the methodology in Hazardous to get these replacement values based on occupancy type and building size. So I would say that is an industry standard. It's a commonly used approach, and yeah, so that's how we use that same approach in this project. Then, Frederic, if you want to add to that, you can.
No, that's great, thanks. But maybe to add one that is maybe not industry standards, but that is special for the South Florida Water Management District, is that we also added a replacement value for the water control structures and also a damage function. And I think that is a very nice addition.
Thank you. Just wanted to let everyone know, we really appreciate the engagement so far. It's been absolutely fantastic. So continue to send in your questions, and I will be sharing a link from Idris in the chat, and I will now pass it over to Nicole. Thank you.
Thanks, Yitzi, and thank you all the panelists and presentation participants that are remote and are answering all of these excellent questions that we're receiving today. We're now on to item number 10 on the agenda, beginning with session 3, to conclude the final presentation set of this workshop. So our next presenter is Mr. Idris Dobbs from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Hello, I'm Idris Dobbs. I'm team lead economist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the Jacksonville district, and I am the lead economist for the Sacs, South Atlantic Coastal Study. You could go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to discuss a couple of the foundational Sacs products and the method for coordinating those tools. Just to give you guys a quick understanding of what we were trying to accomplish with the Sacs. There were a couple of risk assessments. I mean, with the Sacs, it included all the coastal areas, everything from the zone of tidal influence between North Carolina to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, as well as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it was a large area. We had to base risk assessments on existing data sets, and there was just no way to spend a lot of time getting into a bunch of detail for such a large area. Roughly 65,000 miles of coastline is what we had to analyze and understand where the most significant coastal storm risk was, and propose solutions for addressing it to the Congress. So first, we will talk about the development and organization of problems, assumptions, and opportunities, why they matter. Then we'll talk about the Tier 2 economic risk assessment, why it was done, what it contains. Third topic is the measures and cost library. And lastly, we'll cover how these tools can be used in conjunction. Next slide, please. So problems, assumptions, and opportunities. So we typically, in the Corps of Engineers, we typically define a coastal storm risk management related problem as an existing negative condition. Related to coastal storms, it should be described in terms of a resource of concern, the location of the resource, why that resource is under threat, and any supporting evidence for the problem. Problems should not be controversial and are best represented as, simple factual statements with supporting evidence. So risks that are strictly based on quote unquote existing negative conditions are the least speculative. So then we compound that with assumptions about the future. So coastal storm risk management assumptions deal with exogenous factors that can have an influence on the context that can cause a risk to change over time. So for example, there's a resource context, meaning will people take action to protect their property? Is the area depopulating in a way that would render concerns about a threatened resource and material? Is development expected to grow significantly over time? And then there's a spatial context. In an area of concern, are the resources that have not been threatened now, but are expected to be threatened in the future? And what factors would cause that? Then there's a hazard context, which basically deals with, what will cause the hazard to change over time? Is it sea level rise? Is it a rapidly evolving shoreline, tidal forces, and or all of the above? So considerations of the interplay between assumptions and problems may impact the determination of the spatial extent, the nature, severity of any risk identification. Statements about coastal storm risk management assumptions should include that assumption, why it was made, and how you expect it to affect the risk. Since these assumptions involve the future, they're of course, sources of uncertainty. Then there's opportunity. So a coastal storm risk management related opportunity is a desired future positive condition to potentially impact resources as related to coastal storms. So they're derived from careful consideration of the interplay between the problems and the assumptions. Opportunities, the harm hasn't happened yet, but it's expected to in the future if all of your future assumptions keep the same trajectory. So as such, there's an opportunity to, quote, manage a future risk. So risk derived based on opportunities tend to be more speculative. The difference between the two concepts is relevant when you consider risk management actions. Risk based on existing problems involve resources that are under immediate threat, where potential future risks, which are more speculative in nature, there may be more time to address the risk. This informs, this information should be considered when you're developing an array of coastal storm risk management measures, alternatives, or solutions. So could you advance to the next slide, please? So the Tier 2 economic risk assessment purpose, provide information on coastal storm surge inundation risk to public and private property to assist in determination of potential high-risk areas, estimate focus area damages in support of the Sacs, to provide a method that allows users to quickly get an idea of a coastal storm risk associated with an area of concern, provide a method to allow users to quickly scale damages with the cost of measures. The tool can be used to get a rough idea of potential damages and risk for a federal interest determination or an alternative milestone meeting core decision point with minimal effort. So we want to identify areas that warrant a deeper technical analysis. So basically, this graphic depicts a screenshot of the storm surge dollar damage risk for Tampa Bay, Florida. Next slide, please. So in terms of products, the Tier 2 economic risk assessment consists of a technical report and a web application, which we have a screenshot of. The Fema Hazardous flood loss mitigation model was ran on all areas within the zone of tidal influence for North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and the FEMA flood assessment structure tool was used to estimate the storm surge damages for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So similar to the models that have been discussed in this meeting, I mean, we relied heavily on FEMA. We ran the general building stock over all of these areas, primarily because it was a source of existing data. Our consequence and risk estimates were computed for 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year return periods. Economic risk is depicted as the expected annual damages to structures and contents from storm surge. from all return periods, assuming the consequences and likelihoods of the return period events are evenly distributed on an equal annual basis. All consequences and risks are reflected geospatially at the census block level of resolution because that's the limit of the resolution of the general building stock information and hazards. From there, the estimates can be aggregated to census tracts, places, and counties. Scenarios, in terms of risk scenarios, are presented as a range between the low and the high. The low estimate is reflective of shoreline conditions as they are today, and the high estimate with respect to continental United States locations, we added 3 feet of sea level rise. Next slide, please. So key points on Florida risk. Florida potentially accounts for between 84 and 87% of the coastal storm risk in the South Atlantic Division area of responsibility. So that's of all of those 6 states and 2 territories, 84 to 87% of that risk is in the state of Florida. Due to its large coastline, significant population development located in coastal areas, tidally influenced rivers, flat low-lying topography. Risk is concentrated in Southeast Florida, Southwest Florida, Tampa Bay, Northeast and North Central Florida, but primarily by far the largest contribution, the largest concentration of risk is in Palm Beach, Broward County, and Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade, Broward, Lee, and Pinellas counties account for 2/3 of the risk in the state of Florida. So if you look at that graph, and it's probably difficult to see, the bar graph at the top is basically a snapshot of the risk just from Florida, and you can see how much of it is in Southeast Florida. Next slide, please. So this is the Tier 2 Economic Risk Assessment Dashboard. I don't know if we'll have time to do a demo of the dashboard, but I think everyone has the slide, and this graphic can give you a pretty good depiction of what all can be done with it. Would there be time to do a quick demo?
We could, but would you have to run from your computer?
I could. I mean, I could. If not, it's fine. We don't have to. I was just wondering if there was time to do a quick demo. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'll just explain it real quick. So
Perfect.
basically, the dashboard runs from left to right. The left side of the screen shows basically the existing sea level rise condition. The right side shows the future sea level rise condition. Now, as soon as you pull the tool up, it will show you the existing and future condition expected annual damage based on the view extents that you've chosen. If you look at the bar graph on the extreme left, it basically shows you the consequences for each return interval event. So that's given the return interval event, this is everything that happens, and then if you integrate under the curve, basically, you get the expected annual damages under the existing. The future side of the screen it shows everything with the 3 feet of sea level rise added. For Puerto Rico and USVI, 2.3 feet of sea level rise added. You can use the magnifying glass basically to type in what community you're interested in, snap to the area. There are selection tools. You can use a lasso, a polygon, a rectangle, a line, or a point to select your census blocks that you're interested in. Your view extents will automatically update with your existing and future condition damages, and it will reflect basically the number of census blocks that you selected. Next slide. And so with that, we have the measures and cost library. product that we developed. Currently, it exists as a document with lists of tabular data that describe the constant dollar and expected annualized costs for each one of the measures. The measures and cost library is a list of standardized measures that can be used to quickly develop risk management options for addressing coastal storm risk problems. The user specifies a unit parameter and develops a rough order of magnitude range of costs for measures that can serve as potential solutions. Purpose and usage is to basically map a selection of measures and costs to a relevant problem or opportunity, quickly gain an understanding of the rough order of magnitude costs for that coastal storm risk management effort, help users put together a range of measures and a range of rough costs to begin development of alternatives. It was used in the development of focused area action strategies for the South Atlantic Coastal Study, and it could be used to quickly put together measures and costs for federal interest determinations and alternative milestone meeting decision points for Corps of Engineer coastal storm risk management planning. Products, as I mentioned before, it's currently documentation that describes development and assumptions that go into the measures and cost library. Documentation contains the unit cost parameters, and descriptions on how to apply those costs to develop conceptualized costs for coastal storm risk management measures. The measures in the library are non-structural, structural, and natural nature-based features. Your costs are presented in constant and annualized terms, and your equivalent annualized cost can then be compared to your expected annual damages. So some of the cost-based considerations or non-cost-based considerations. As you see in the graphic here, what we're talking about is the conceptualization of risk that we typically use. So you got basically a hazard, which is an inundation, wave attack, or erosion loading condition from the coastal storm. It's associated with some kind of it's a stochastic event. It's associated with a probability of occurrence, and that's what snaps it into the realm of risk. So the performance in physical settings is basically the ability to manage an incidence of the loading condition. So how well can that loading condition occur within your physical setting prior to producing an event? So for example, you see from the graphic a levee, whereas maybe a 10-year or 5-year event may not exceed what's needed. If it stops at the levee, then your risk chain stops there because nothing is propagating into your exposure. Then you have exposure, which we're all familiar with, which is who or what we care about that's subject to the harm. And then vulnerability, which is susceptibility of the exposure to the harm, which is basically embodied in the damage functions that you described. And for the Corps of Engineers, we make this, we specify a consequence, which we think in terms of a description or a quantification of the harm that's, in terms that are meaningful to a decision maker. The only reason to do this kind of work, is if you're trying to inform or influence some kind of a decision. And so describing your risk in terms that are meaningful for the one who has to make the decision is probably the most productive way to do this kind of coastal storm risk management. So it's basically a description of the harm given that the loading condition has actually happened, that the storm event that we're talking about has actually happened. Those non-cost considerations deal with non-cost consideration. We have an approach which deals with which risk component is manipulated to manage the risk, a method which deals with how the risk component is manipulated, The CSRM function describes whether reducing inundation, wave attack, and or erosion are primary or secondary functions of the measure. Then the applicability deals with the measure's ability to handle wave energy. Basically, where are you citing, where are you going to cite the measure? And is it cited in an area where it can handle the coastal forces that are going to be thrown at it? Physical and temporal considerations deal with how the measure influences physical condition to achieve a risk management effect, and a qualitative assessment of when those effects will be realized over time. And then we have like our P&G account, which is basically qualitative assessment of which of the P&G accounts could be used to describe measure effects. So for the Corps of Engineers, when we describe the effects of a plan for plan formulation purposes, we have an NED account, which is National Economic Development, which is basically the dollar value of the physical capital that could be destroyed or degraded during a coastal storm. And then we have what's called a Regional Economic Development account, which is how, given that you've disrupted this physical capital, what happens to your ability to produce? What happens to employment, regional employment, and regional economic output? Then there's the other social effects, which deals with what happens to public safety, what happens to community resiliency and ability to bounce back, and so on and so forth, given that you've had these impacts to your physical capital and your economic base. Also, what we talk about is a qualitative assessment of sea level rise adaptability. It's also included. These are items that are in the document itself. In terms of cost considerations, we factor in the regional location, and that is the regional location factors into the conceptual design. And then we have cost components, which are basically what is the minimum number of dimensions you need to describe an alternative in order to be able to reasonably cost it out. That information is in the document. We also include contingency, engineering and design, supervision, administration, and for the nature-based features, there's monitoring and adaptive management. And there's also uncertainty included in the cost estimates in terms of unit quantities and unit prices. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide basically this is a list of all the measures that are included in the measures and cost library. The ones in the green are basically your performance-based measures. So with the performance-based measures, you're trying to enhance the ability to manage the risk loading condition. So for example, if you're trying to enhance the performance of the physical setting, perhaps you want to raise it from maybe you've got a 10-year level of protection, you want to raise it to a 50 or 100-year level of protection. So it enhances the ability to manage that loading condition. And these are primarily your structural and natural nature-based features. They manage risk by either coastline armoring, coastline stabilization, or coastline restoration. Then you have your exposure-based measures. These temporarily or permanently reduce the size of the exposure. Then you have your vulnerability-based measures. These enhance the resiliency of the exposure. So, for example, these would be dry or wet flood proofing. For example, elevating your utilities, those kinds of options. Whereas exposure-based measures would be you're doing buyouts. You're doing temporary evacuations so that you save people's lives, or you just move them out of the exposed area altogether. And then decision-based measures is basically all of the above, structured over time. You're addressing the risk by decision making, and its primary focus is on managing any risk to the future exposure. Next slide, please. So this is basically the process of using the Tier 2 economic risk assessment along with the measures and cost library tools. So the first step, obviously, is to identify your problem extent based on considerations of problems, assumptions, and opportunities. You would then use your web tool to select the census blocks within those extents. You'd record the range of risk and consequences for your existing and future conditions. These will form the low and high of your estimates. Next slide. You would then use your measures and cost library and select an array of measures that align with your problem. You enter in your estimated measure length or other parameters, and those are described in the document. So for example, if we're talking about a seawall, you would just enter the length of the seawall. If we're talking about beach nourishment, you would enter the length of the area that you would want to nourish, and you would also have to enter in the number of nourishments that you think you would need. So what you see in the slide here is basically information taken out of the measures and cost library and put in like a spreadsheet format, so that you can do some quick calculations and so on and so forth. So then you'd observe the range of your constant dollar or annualized cost. You can look at your constant dollar cost relative to your consequences, or you would compare your annualized cost to your expected annual damages. Your decision criteria then would be, a measure is likely too expensive if the high range of the costs exceed the low range of the consequences or the risk. So you need to be aware of the data gaps and limitations in some of these tools to evaluate your risk and your uncertainties, and verify whether or not you can make information based on these, based on these numbers and based on the risk included. And so it's important to note that these are tools basically to get people started. You don't want to base your investment decision. You don't want to base investment decisions on this. This is a guide basically to get you started and steer you in the right direction. And so we're pretty upfront about that because, given the scope of the Sacs, we can only steer people in the right direction and try to give them an idea of what they're looking at in terms of cost, in terms of, the effectiveness of certain measures, given what you want to accomplish. It's important to really think about what is at risk when you're talking about measures. With the Corps of Engineers, one of the things that we have to do is, we have these risk assessments that are performed by the we call it the RMC, the Risk Management Center. They're out in Colorado. And one of the key things that we have to look at is the potential for life safety risk. And, if you're citing a measure in an area that, sure, you may have a lot of property damage, but it could also be a source of life safety risk, well, then that should be a factor in how robust your measure is. The consequences of a failure could be a lot higher if you pick a measure that's not as robust. So that's all I had. Next slide is questions or discussion. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer them. But that's the end of my presentation.
We are going to have 2 more presentations and then coming back to our final question and answer session. So are you okay to wait for 2 more, Idris, there?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay. So let's transition to Francisco.
Hi, Francisco Peña with the South Florida Water Management District, and today I'll be talking about the tool application. In addition, I will share some examples on how the tool outputs under different contexts can support the decision-making process by evaluating direct impacts to infrastructure for short and long-term planning. The SFWMD-FIAT tool is capable of translating hydrodynamic modeling results event scenarios into economic risk assessments by combining exposure data and flood maps with damage curves to calculate the flood damages and risk per object. As part of my PhD research, I used a couple flood2D and mudflow model to evaluate flood conditions in the Arch Creek Basin located in North Miami for short, middle, and long-term scenarios. This area is particularly vulnerable to all kinds of flooding conditions. Therefore, I decided to use this geographical area to study those vulnerabilities, not just from a mapping perspective, but also from an economic assessment point of view. A multivariate statistical analysis was applied to obtain the joint dependency structure between rainfall and tide levels gauge records within a 15-mile ratio from the study site. Then the combination with the most extreme behavior was selected for a 100-year return period, and 3 realizations from the isoline characterized by only surge, A, most likely, B, and heavy rainfall, C, were selected to run the validated model. Please note that the quantile isolines are based on historic data collected by the district, observed records from S29R and S28T. Even A not really show a major surge event, as you can see here on the y-axis. This is just an event that is dominated by the tide. For the purposes of this presentation, it will be referred as only surge, even if it's not the case. The goal of selecting 3 realizations was to evaluate which scenario causes the most damage. Predefined groundwater levels on the y-axis and sea level rise scenarios were included into the ensemble realizations to compare the contribution and relevance of flooding mechanisms in respect to flood depth, extent, and damage potential. To calculate the damage assessment for all the flood maps, the maps must be saved to the SFWMD-FIAT hazard folder and make sure the exposure data has been created for the area of study. Here are the results from the FIAT tool, displaying different degrees of flood damage, the color bars, corresponding to the hydrologic forcing as mentioned in my previous slide. As we can see, sea level rise clearly exacerbates flooding conditions for middle, 2070, and long-term, 2120 scenarios. So this is one way on how to use the tool. The graph is useful, but there is a lot of information to digest. Now, let's look at some hypothetical examples to provide context when evaluating flood vulnerabilities. Let's say that you want to assess the damage of individual flood drivers versus a compound event under these conditions. So first, you calculate the damage for rainfall plus the water table, followed by the surge plus the water table. Here's the total flood damage and the combined flood inundation map from both drivers. Now, on your right, you can see the results for the compound event. Here, all flood drivers were simulated using an integrated modeling approach. From a quick visual comparison, it seems that the flood inundation depths and extents are quite similar between models. Nevertheless, some locations experience higher flooding conditions near the canals and coastal domain, as the compound model is able to simulate the interaction of rainfall, coastal surge, the water table, and sea level rise, resulting in higher flood damages compared to individual flood drivers. Thus, it is advantageous to use the tool to better estimate potential monetary losses due to compound flooding scenarios compared to simulating flood drivers separately. Now, jumping into example number 1, let's suppose that Megan is an elected official for a city in North Miami. She has noticed an increase in coastal flooding over the past years So she's certainly concerned about coastal property values, and she's interested in understanding worst-case flooding scenarios under the most optimistic sea level rise projection to justify investments in the region. So her team of experts get together and simulate a number of compound flood scenarios for a range of precipitation and surge levels using a 3-feet water table. Results indicate that an only surge event for year 2120 will cause the worst economic damage in the coastal boundary, as high tide stages coupled with sea level rise are likely to exacerbate hazard to coastal and waterfront properties. So she tailors the grant application based on these results. Nevertheless, a few weeks later, she's notified that the grant application requires the projected damage assessment for year 2040 instead of year 2120. The total damage table for year 2040 suggests that the Arch Creek Basin is more vulnerable to heavy rainfall compared to tidal forcing conditions. So just to be clear, we are not advising you which scenario to use, but we're just trying to give you an example of what the process may look like for potential users when analyzing different events. Here's another example. Michael is the planning director for a city in North Miami and is responsible to adapt the city's infrastructure for future flooding conditions over the next 50 years. Michael is building a strong case on the importance of raising buildings and roads in the area by calculating direct projected damages to infrastructure if no action is taken. He uses the NOAA intermediate high, the compact suggestion for long-term planning, and look at the differences in total damage for each scenario. Although the only surge event produces a higher projected damage, Michael selects the most likely event for his grant application as it has a higher probability of occurrence compared to the other events. In summary, the SFWMD-FIAT tool translates hydrodynamic modeling results into economic risk assessments. It supports the selection of advanced H&H models that can produce more accurate flood risk estimates, while neglecting the dependence of flood drivers certainly reduces the accuracy of estimations. Performs future flood damage cost estimates using multiple flood elevation or inundation scenarios developed as part of future conditions modeling efforts. And last but not least, it helps support recommendations for flood mitigation and adaptation measures by providing a non-action cost baseline. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, I'm Dave Colangelo. I'm the district's Resiliency Grant Manager. And first I want to thank Francisco for choosing a photo of me that makes me 7 years younger than I am. So I'm going to be talking about the C8 basin and a FEMA grant application that the district has submitted in 2021. The C8 basin has a population of about 270,000 people, 19% that are financially disadvantaged. It encompasses about 28 square miles in the northeastern portion of Miami-Dade County. It's fully developed with residential and commercial, and it includes critical assets such as fire stations, emergency operations, schools and emergency shelters, utilities, medical facilities, and others. Oops. So the project is the area is the S28 coastal structure, and that's within the C8 basin. The C8 Canal and the S28 coastal structure are the main flood control features in the area, and they convey floodwaters to Biscayne Bay by gravity. The C8 basin flood control system is controlled and managed by the district, South Florida Water Management District, and secondary canals are managed by Miami-Dade County. Over the course of the past 50 years or so, 50 to 70 years, the flood control system has begun to be affected by sea level rise. And that's the purpose of this grant proposal, is to make improvements to the C8 Basin flood control system. So this is an image of the C8 Basin flood inundation map under a 100-year sea level rise event or a 100-year event with 3-foot sea level rise. You can see there's a lot of flooding along the canal systems, especially in the coastal areas, but it actually generates upstream as well. So just to give you an idea of the risks and the challenges we're facing in this basin. The 2021 FEMA grant proposal for the C8 Basin includes, the goal of it is actually to reduce flood risk under sea level rise by restoring the discharge capacity of the S28 structure. As I mentioned before, it's been impacted already by increased sea levels, and it's currently not operating as designed. So the project includes replacement of the S28 structure with a more robust structure and elevated components to withstand impacts of sea level rise and climate change. This will include installation of a 500 cubic foot per second forward pump station that's right next to the S28 structure in order to try to continue to maintain basin discharge levels as sea levels rise. The pump station can actually be, it'll be modular, so you can add on to it as you have more impacts in the future. Also includes construction of a flood barrier that ties the S28 structure to higher ground and mitigates against the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge. This proposal also incorporates some nature-based solutions, enhancement of secondary canal banks throughout the basin to improve flow to the primary canal, construction of a temporary floodwater detention area on a portion of the Miami Shores golf course right next to the S28 structure. And this detention area can provide temporary storage of floodwaters during extreme events. Also includes installation of nature-based features such as living shoreline along the C8 canal and vegetated berms that help to enhance flood control within the basin and along the golf course. It's an image of a conceptual plan for the C8 Basin. You can see the storm surge barrier on the lower right area of the image shows the storm surge barrier connecting from the S28 structure to the railroad tracks, which is higher ground to the east. It includes the forward pump, 500 CFS forward pump. There's a gated culvert that connects the C8 canal to the temporary storage area, temporary detention area. Let's see, there's a berm, there would be a berm that follows around 9-foot elevation around the storage area. And this area would really only be used during an extreme event where the canal is overwhelmed and basically the system is overwhelmed. So they get a little bit extra storage in the system. Here's results of the 100-year event with 3-foot sea level rise, and it shows the reduction in flooding in the basin. So you can see the colored areas in the eastern portion of the image show that flood depths have been reduced due to implementation of the project. And my last slide, it's showing a practical application of the FIAT tool. So part of applying for grants and FEMA grants in particular, in most grants, you need to calculate a benefit cost ratio. And so the FIAT tool allows us to calculate that BCR by calculating estimated annual damage over all flood return frequencies. So the top line here is the estimated annual damage without any kind of mitigation implemented. The second line is estimated annual damage with mitigation implemented, meaning the pump and the seawall and the other features. And the third line is the difference between those two, or the annual benefit of about close to $17 million annually. So over the life of the project, the cost would be about $78 million, and the total benefits over the life of the project would be $233 million. And from that, you get a benefit cost ratio of approximately 3, which is pretty good. And we hope it's going to help us get some grant money this year. And that's all I have for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, Dave, Francisco, and Idris. That concludes the presentations from the third session of this workshop. We are now entering our final Q&A session. For anyone here, please raise your hand if you have any questions. And I believe we already have some questions received through the Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Yitzi.
Thank you, Nicole. For the first question is, for the SACS, you showed a graph showing how risk is concentrated in Southeast Florida, and it looks like risks are broken down by municipality. Would it be possible to get more details about the risk broken down by counties instead of municipalities?
This is Idris. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yes, it would be. I can get that information to you relatively easily if I have a point of contact. There's also information in the Tier 2 Economic Risk Assessment documentation, I believe, that has information on the county, the distribution of risk in Southeast Florida on a county-by-county basis. So yes, it's possible to get that answer, to get that information.
Thank you. I believe the next question is for you as well. Is there an option to upload a shapefile to choose area of interest, for example, City of Miami, instead of manually selecting on the map?
For the Tier 2 ERA at this time, no, it's not possible. You have to pretty much select all of your, you have to select the census blocks on your own. We don't have that capability right now.
Okay, thank you. I believe the following two questions are for you as well. For SACS Economic Loss Viewer Tool Online, it's really great comment. But would it be possible for local government to get the outputs as GIS layers for our jurisdiction so we can do some more analyses?
I think there would be. I have to get with our GIS lead to get more information on when the download features will be made active, so people can actually download the data. But it's definitely intended so that people can download information.
Fantastic. And then the final question for you is, for the cost library, is there any adjustment factors that are already included or that we could include at the local level to account for differences in local construction costs?
Yes, there are. If you go into the documentation, there are tables that show each of the cost components and what we're reflecting for each of those cost components. So it is possible to go in and substitute your own values and recompute the rough order magnitude costs.
Fantastic, thank you. I believe the following two questions are for Francisco. So slide 4, could you explain how you chose the title elevations?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Catherine, for your question. So first of all, the methodology that was applied in order to understand the joint probability of multiple flow drivers interacting within similar spatial and temporal scales was used from our colleagues from University of Central Florida, Robert Jane and Thomas Wall. They developed this analysis for different locations in Florida at the coast. So I applied their methodology to understand the joint dependence extractive of rainfall, tide levels, and the water table in North Miami. And the isoline, let's say the most extreme isoline for a 100-year return period was obtained for that specific combination using the gauge records from the area. That's based on historical data. So it was not a random or aleatory procedure, but it was based on the most extreme isoline curve from different combinations. And now to answer your second question for slide 11, you show the difference in loss between compound events and looking at flood risk individually, and show a modest increase of 11% in a compound event. But have you looked at other tidal elevations? For example, will those losses be higher in a more severe storm surge scenario? The answer for that question is that I have run the tool for most combinations, not all of them, but I can tell you there is a consistent difference that, well, range difference between 10 to 15% increase when the model simulates, well, if you compare individual flood drivers separately and then you add them up compared to a compound flood inundation model that simulates the interaction of all flood drivers within the same modeling framework.
Can I add just something quickly here? We talked a little bit about that, Francisco, and I think the question also talks about like really bringing a storm surge scenario that we are going to be evaluating next. So right now, if you notice, the data that we are using is from S28 tidal and S29 rainfall, which is further inland a little bit. So we are basing the tidal elevation in this compound flooding analysis only on the records that we have at the S28 structure. So we have not fully evaluated different storm surge scenarios yet. So I believe as part of some of the future efforts, we'll be able to perhaps bring a larger storm surge and map this and really fully compare storm surge, rainfall, and then the compounding impacts.
Thank you. We have another question for Francisco. For the Arch Creek area, are you taking into consideration the existing stormwater pump station from Miami-Dade County?
So just to be clear, for the model and for the purpose of my dissertation, the storm drain system and the pump station were not considered into the modeling framework due to time limitations, but also data constraints regarding the storm drain system. That will be another effort that will be incorporated in the near future for the flow-to-the mud flow modeling work in the Arch Creek Basin.
Thank you. Next question is for Idris. Does the SACS add sea level rise to storm surge or assess storm surge and sea level rise separately?
The Sacs add sea level rise onto storm surge.
Thank you. Third.
Yeah, this is Hong Yin Zhao from the district, and I have three questions for SAC presentation. The first question is, in one of the slides, you showed $9 billion damage for the current condition and the $24 billion for the future condition. Are those damage every year or for a 50-year period?
Those are the expected annual damages on an annualized basis.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question is about the measure and the cost library. And how current are the data reflected in that library?
Right now, the measure and cost library data is reflective of 2020 prices.
Okay, thank you. And my third question is about the decision criteria. In one of the slides, you listed one decision criteria, and it says the lower end of the cost is higher than the upper end of the damage of the benefit, then probably it's not efficient. Is that the only criteria recommended?
Well, that's basically the criteria for trying to understand if there's federal interest in a project. Typically, we base plan formulation on national economic development criteria, and so you typically have to have a benefit to cost ratio above 1 to move forward. And so this is basically an order of magnitude level analysis, whereas usually when you have, you're talking a tier 3 feasibility study level analysis, whatever measure that you include rarely will it reduce all of the damages. It's going to reduce some percentage of the damages. And so if under the best case scenario, you have no hope of reducing enough damage to warrant the cost of your project, that's what that's trying to capture. But again, that's, quick, rough order of magnitude NED calculations to help you make some entry-level screening decisions. You may conclude that you want to justify your project based on other decision criteria. Within the Corps of Engineers, there's the possibility to do that, but it requires a lot of coordination with our vertical chain in order to get that actualized. So for most of the stuff that we do a lot of our entry level and screening level decisions based on any national economic development criteria. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Final call for any more questions. Just a reminder, if you're on Zoom, you can use the raise hand feature, enter your question into the question and answer function, or if you're on the phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand or *6 to mute and unmute after we call on you. Seeing no further questions, we will continue.
Thank you, Yitzi. We will now move to our public comments session. This is open to anyone attending in person. You can submit a public comment card located at the front here, or if you're online via Zoom, you can also submit your public comments via Zoom. We will leave it open for a little bit in case anyone wants some time to think and submit something, and then we'll follow up with final and closing remarks.
Just a reminder, if you're on Zoom, you can use the raise hand feature, or if you're on your phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand.
Okay, we did not receive any public comments, but we did receive, oh, sorry, maybe we did.
We have a raised hand from Idris. Idris, if you want to go ahead.
Oh, thank you. In some of the presentations I've seen, there are analyses that are done at the basin level, and they're capturing, if we did X, Y, or Z, we could protect this particular asset inventory from all of the structures. Question I have is, does that account for, for example, if you may have a multi-dimensional flood risk problem? For example, even though the asset that's located within a certain basin could contribute to the flooding, what if the flooding comes from somewhere in another basin or another location? Does it account for that?
Start answering the question, and I will turn to Honging in case she wants to add anything. But the way we set up the phase 1 assessments as part of FPLOS is we look at a basin by basin or some groups of basins to capture exactly what you are describing there, a potential connection between some areas that would have a more regional relevance in terms of factors that would influence flooding on that specific location. So we started in Miami and more, I would say, in smaller groups of basins. When we moved to Broward, we were able to look at all the sets of basins in Broward, and we are also moving to Palm Beach, looking at the entire basin. So not the entire county, but most of the county area is covered in this assessment. So really increasing our ability to look potentially at those factors that will influence not only at a basin scale, but like at a more regional scale. There is a balance that we are still trying to find there in terms of how far we can go to really look more regionally versus how much we can capture also those local needs that we know will happen in those basins that we want to be able to capture with our model. We had some interesting discussions about that too. But so the answer to your question is partially. In some of the cases we can, and we will be able to evaluate more of those intra-basin type of flood drivers and also solutions, like just jumping to one of the discussions we had is if we implement, for instance, interbasin connections, we will enhance our ability to move water to another basin in anticipation of a storm, of a flood event, a rain event, or even like just move water more easily during the storm. So yes, we understand we need to have this capacity, and we are finding the balance there between the regional and the local representation in the model. Okay.
Thank you.
We have another question. Are there any thoughts on going further north into St. Lucie County?
Yes, St. Louis County is also on our list. I think it's probably in the next 2 years we will get to St. Louis County.
Thank you.
Okay. I think with no more questions or public comments, we're going to move to some closing remarks, and we're going to ask some questions to you in a little bit if you are willing to help us. So please stay there a little bit, just a few more minutes with us. I would first thank you for all the speakers. I think everybody was really modest in introducing themselves. We decided to introduce each other without like spending time with the bio because we do have so much information to share. But we have so many great presenters here today with us and also on the phone. So thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your availability to be here with us and share your knowledge. And I also want to thank our partnership with Deltares. We have a great team there. I know Catherine raised some of those positive aspects of this team interaction during this project, which were really good. And I thought it was very productive in terms of advancing a tool that we could bring some of the solutions to the district, but in a really collaborative way. So I really appreciate this partnership that we have in this one more project here at the district. And really your expertise, bringing your expertise to support our efforts. Thanks, Frederick, thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Claire. Claire, I know you're going to be moving back to Netherlands. We'll miss you here in Florida. I hope they can build up this strong relationship with the Florida stakeholders here soon, because we have been working on a few projects. So again, thank you for the collaboration. And then I'll bring in, sorry, I want to also thank the district team. I almost skipped this. I know we developed, the big and positive aspect of this work was also our ability to really work in collaboration. And our geospatial team did an incredible job, not only on fully capturing the way the tool was being developed by Deltares, how we communicate between our databases and the tool, and really capturing the best available information. So Chris, under the leadership of Kurt, and I think you did an incredible job, so thank you very much for getting this level of information that we were able to develop for this tool. And everybody else involved in this project, providing review, Hong Ging and the FPLOS team, did like an extensive review during the entire process to be able, again, the tool was being developed with the main purpose of serving the phase 2 studies of FPLOS. So the engagement from the beginning of this project until the end was really effective in translating the tool to something that will be directly applied as part of the FPLOS efforts. And then talking about the application of the tool, I think we were able to demonstrate to this workshop how this is important for the decision-making process, is really critical in helping the district to assess the different strategies that we have, to also look at the economic perspective and how we can evaluate those flood risk options to our communities here in South Florida. So I hope we were able to demonstrate the relevance of this step, this additional decision-making step, as part of our planning efforts here at the district. The benefit cost analysis really help us to demonstrate the feasibility of those adaptive solutions. As we saw with the brick grant example, we do see a positive 3 benefit cost ratio, which means that our projects are showing feasibility, are demonstrating feasibility, and again, demonstrating the relevance of us to be able to advance those solutions. And also the cost estimates give us one more way for looking at, for instance, compound flooding. I really like the approach that Francisco used in his presentation when he was able to demonstrate with economic values what is the difference between looking individually at each of those flooding drivers and in a compound setting. So it helps us to explain how this happens and how we can start looking at those different impacts and benefits. We are in a very competitive environment for funding right now, and we understand that having the capacity to also demonstrate this economic flood damage reduction will help us, again, to be competitive, not only us, but I believe our region, Florida, really needs to be able to advance those tools, these assessments, and start looking in a more integrated way on what are the alternatives that we have. And I think the positive thing is that we can do that fast. We showed today relatively fast. We showed today that we have not a too cumbersome, not an extremely complex process to the application of this tool, that we can really do some fast analysis and understanding what are the key relevant aspects that we need to do, that we have data here, that we have the tool that is open source. And we also build in a way that we aggregate the outputs, that we can easily read what are the major outputs. Just to give you an idea, one of the basins, when we are doing work at C8, C9 basin, for one of the basins, C8 basin, we have an Excel spreadsheet with 300,000 lines. So to have the capacity to sort through this data, to compile, to aggregate somehow this information is critical, so we can evaluate the different aspects of how we want to translate this information, and not just the cost-benefit analysis at the end, but throughout the basin, the different parts, giving the ability to do some social vulnerability analysis that we also did with the tool, that we brought with the tool. So incredible work there. I'm going to talk quickly about 2 grant options. So we know Resilient Florida program is now going through a rulemaking process, and some points are being associated with the ability to demonstrate cost-benefit analysis. So it's good that we can evolve with this tool and have the capacity for our region to be able to start demonstrating those calculations. And as mentioned by Dave in his presentation, where he summarized one of our BRIC applications, it is a requirement, so we need to be able to advance those analysis once we are ready to apply for those grant fundings. We're going to also initiate a study next with the Army Corps. We are ready to begin later in the fall this year. That's going to be our CNSF, our Central and Southern Florida Flood Project, evaluating flood resiliency. And we know the discussions that we are having today here are really an important step as part of this study. This is going to be a flood risk management type of study, where we have to go through the steps of evaluating cost-benefit analysis. I think what we showed today is that we have strong data, approach, tools that will be very strategic as we advance this study. And also one interesting aspect is that it was evident that we are able to leverage coastal damages. Idris presented a lot of this data in terms of evaluating a coastal type of impact and those damages using the tools that were developed as part of the South Atlantic Coastal Study. and then leveraging that with also the inland assessments that we have been doing as part of the level of service program. So the level of service focus, it accounts for the coastal impacts as well, but it really focuses on the inland portions of the system, also looking at rainfall. So the ability to lever both of those through the CNSF study is going to be an important step. And I'm glad we are having those discussions here today. And finally, I think the tool, I like to say that the tool will be helping us as we advance our South Florida Water Management District Sea Level Rise and Flood Resiliency Plan. We have a list of projects there that were prioritized since last year, and we are updating on a yearly basis, and to have the ability to evolve with benefit cost analysis for those projects and really compare. We have a large list, relatively large list of projects that are coming from different assessments from the level of service. So having the ability to also compare the projects using this cost benefit analysis and also demonstrate the feasibility of those projects in the plan through the further application of the tool is going to be really advantageous for us. We talked today about some of the next steps and how we can improve the tool. I thought we had great ideas and great discussions. So we talk about automating the exposure, database development and linking to the tool, revisiting some of the new curves, validating some of the damage curves, enhancing our capacity to fully capture the benefits. I think Claire and Catherine talk about cascading impacts. Right now, we are really focusing on the immediate damage, so to properties, to roads and utilities, but knowing, as demonstrated, once we have a roadblock, we have other consequences, other cascading impacts that occur in the basins, and perhaps we can and should be able to capture those as part of our cost-benefit analysis as well. And also, I think Idris presented really well on the need for us to further evaluate also environmental aspects, some of the social aspects. So giving us the capacity to really expand how we account for those benefits is going to be critical as part of next steps. I really like the discussion about the sensitivity analysis on the first floor elevation and some of the ways that we could be capturing cost updates as we evolve and really want to maintain the tool as something that is available for everybody to be applying and utilizing. And with that, I'll bring my last slide here, which is really inviting you all for collaborating with us. So as we mentioned, we partner with the ATARES to enhance and customize this tool and facilitate the use and the post-processing of all those results. We leverage the ATARES expertise in building this exposure database that we have, and we are identifying additional sources of data and really the workflows and how we can process all of that as part of the tool. We are committed to continue enhancement of the tool and to include this automated exposure data compilation and processing tools, as we mentioned, as part of some of the next steps. And we want to make it clear to you that the FIAT tool is an open source tool. It is available for download, along with the user manual that was developed for our work here, for the district work. So we customize the tool. It's an open source tool. We have a user manual that was very well developed, but the tool itself is for use as is. So there is no troubleshooting or any technical support available for anyone to apply the tool. We will be providing data, so that's a commitment. So we have existing exposure data sets that are available via email request. I'm giving there the email for you to reach out if you want these data sets. And just to let you know, the way we will be advancing the development of new data sets, we will be following the level of service phase 2 studies schedule. So as we begin advancing those phase 2 studies is when we're going to be building those data sets, leveraging, again, existing data and information available in each of those areas. And finally, we really welcome partnerships to further develop automation of this many ideas that we discussed today, and I have 2 of them listed here, but we welcome you all to collaborate, make recommendations, and really partner with us for the continuous efforts in terms of involving those discussions. I'm going to open quickly. I hope I can do that. If not, I will ask Itzi to help me here. But I will invite you to send us some of the, oh, I got it. The mouse was not working. So we did a quick mean effort here. Sorry, I'm using the wrong, Menti effort here to ask for some input from you all. So this tool is very easy if you have a cell phone or if any of you want to just send us comments, you have just to type this number. You go to their website, it's straightmenti.com. And then please type this number 39008229 and send us some of the ways you anticipate you might be using this tool. Is it useful for you at any of your current efforts, some of the efforts that we are anticipating to occur in the near future? How do you think this is a useful tool? And I'm seeing some of the questions popping out already. Thank you very much. So giving a few more minutes for any participant to just give us ideas on how we can apply this tool and any additional studies that you might be interested. Thank you, yeah, in support of the district proposals, grant applications. Any more? Anybody else with more ideas? Yeah, it doesn't cover St. Lucie yet, so I won't be able to yet. We will be moving to St. Lucie next, hopefully in the next 2 years, as Hong Ying mentioned. Exposure databases and the need to support. It's a little bit, oh, maybe I can hear that. Much better here. Exposure database and more to support our local vulnerability assessments and local adaptation planning. Perfect, yes. I think we do develop some great data in our exposure databases that can be very useful, capturing some of the critical infrastructure as well. There is one functionality, I don't remember if we mentioned, but you can also filter damage to critical infrastructure only as part of the tool application, so the aggregation tools that we have. DM, exposure damage curves, ties to transportation. Yes, great. Thank you. Definitely that's something that we need to evolve a little bit more. We were talking about the cascading impacts there from road blockages and everything, so. Great. I think I'll move to one more question. Oh, there is one more. Thank you. Potential use as an adjacent water management district areas. Yeah. Good. So let's move to one more question. Any suggestions on how can we improve the tool? Yeah, the cost.
We need to automate the ability to put in an inflation factor or something like that.
That was a really valid comment.
Right, that would be.
Yeah, let's add it. Really increase the ability to bring the inflation factor. That's one of the recommendations that I think we got through the workshop discussions here, so that the costs can be up to date and we don't quickly have the tool with old values there that would not facilitate the calculation of the benefits cost analysis. So any more ideas on how can we improve the tool? Well, I would think about that. We have our SMMS. I don't know if Hong Ying, if you want to mention a little bit about that, but that's basically a server that we have in place that we make all those models available. And I think that's a message that is important to share as well. We talk about more complex age and age assessments. So being able to run those more advanced hydrologic models might be I would say, expensive to do, and time-wise also take a little bit of resources there. But we have a tool in place that we make data and results available in all the basins that we already developed level of service. So if you want to have access to those, not only the model itself, the input data, but especially the results. So we do have results from those models also available via this portal. I'll share through this slide at the end. Once we make this slide a public one, I'll send the link to the SMMS. I think this is really relevant because we are talking here about inundation scenarios and the ability to evaluate those adaptation strategies. And we do have data available for download for all the basins where we already developed the level of service. So we'll share the link with that. So in case any of those municipalities, local governments within the basins where we have results are interested in getting those results, that's another step. So the input for this specific to our inundations, so the inundation depths from different scenarios and the exposure database. So all of this information will be available through this portal, and we'll share the link with you all. So all good? Any more suggestions? Please feel free to reach out later via the district. We do have the district our resiliency email. So if you have suggestions for improvements later, if you want to take a little bit more time, please don't hesitate to reach out and really talk to us about any of your needs and opportunities for collaboration. With that, I think we're ready to adjourn. Okay, thanks everyone for participating.